Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Paideia Today. As always, I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and joined here, as always, by my colleague and friend, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we have an author and a work, really a couple of works in front of us, with which our listeners may be more familiar. And I'm talking here about George Orwell, and very specifically his novel 1984. Many of you might have read this in your high school years, or maybe it's still in front of you. But in any event, it's a particularly well-known, well-read text in an age which is, you could arguably say, not terribly literary to begin with. And Dr. Masson, you have a passage to read to us. Would you like to read that to us now?
Sure, I'll be happy to do that. Just to set it up a little bit, at this point in the novel, part 3 of 3 parts, the hero of the novel, Winston Smith, has been incarcerated in the so-called Ministry of Love, which is a prison in which the prisoners are broken and tortured, and he is facing his inquisitor, a man by the name of O'Brien, who he had been deceived about, thought he was his friend, and in fact he had been spying upon him the whole time and now has him in his clutches. And this is O'Brien speaking, or rather the narrator, Orwell, narrating about O'Brien's speech. So I'll pick it up there. His voice had grown almost dreamy. The exultation, the lunatic enthusiasm was still in his face. He is not pretending, thought Winston. He is not a hypocrite. He believes every word he says. What most oppressed him was the consciousness of his own intellectual inferiority. He watched the heavy yet graceful form strolling to and fro, in and out of range of his vision. O'Brien was a being in all ways larger than himself. There was no idea that he had ever had or could have that O'Brien had not long ago known, examined, and rejected. His mind contained Winston's mind. But in that case, how could it be true that O'Brien was mad? It must be he, Winston, who was mad. O'Brien halted and looked down at him. His voice had grown stern again. Do not imagine that you will save yourself, Winston, however completely you surrender to us. No one who has ever gone astray is ever spared. And even if we choose to let you live out the natural term of your life, still you would never escape from us. What happens to you here is forever. Understand that in advance. We shall crush you down to the point from which there is no coming back. Things will happen to you from which you could not recover if you lived 1,000 years. Never again will you be capable of ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship or joy of living or laughter or curiosity or courage or integrity. You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves. So that passage, as I say, with O'Brien speaking to Winston Smith in prison, speaks very much of the general tenor of the novel 1984, which is about a totalitarian regime that does exactly what O'Brien has said he is going to do to Winston Smith, which is that it hollows people out of all human identity. It's very much of a dehumanizing novel. It is a political novel. It demonstrates very much the totalitarian regimes of the period, particularly Stalinism, I think. But I would say that, and I think we're in agreement on this, Bill, it's not only to be applied to Stalinist regimes, but is characteristic, and this is the other feature we're going to speak about here, characteristic of Orwell's work on language. This work, Politics in the English Language, here that I have here, lesser read but no less important, I think. It's an essay, and what is interesting about 1984 is very much how the totalitarian regime operates at the level of not just words but thought, and that's what he is identified here. They're going to control you down to the point where there is nothing left of you that could be recognized as human. And that I think we can come back to this issue of the dehumanization inherent in not just totalitarian regimes, but in a use of language that I think is going to be the substance of our discussion today.
Yeah, the novel is about many things, and they are pressing issues. In some senses, the action of the novel is prescient in certain ways. But I'm old enough to actually remember when 1984, the year came and went, and people got very excited just because it aligned quite nicely with the stars. And there, his George Orwell's book, written in 1948, comes around to 1984. And a lot of people did some soul searching, and a little bit of navel gazing as well went along with that. But one of the points that was impressed upon me at the time was that the novel is about things which are not necessarily bound up to certain points and events in history. It explores the totalitarian impulse in the human experience, and this impulse towards totalitarianism, imposing your own personality, or in this case, the state's personality, upon the individual's identity, hollowing that individual identity out, hollowing out that value, that individual value. It's not just value, it's individual value. The totalitarian mindset loathes individual value and identity, and they want to get rid of it and replace it with type identity. This was a common standard feature of Stalinist thinking. I've read some recent Canadian high school descriptions of course packages that are meant to address in high school this novel 1984. And what I find curious is that they tend not to discuss the connection and influence of Orwell's personal experience with communism and Stalinist communism specifically, and instead tend to talk about the totalitarianism of the novel in terms of Nazi tendencies and Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini and people like this. When in point of fact, I am very careful to stick with the term totalitarian mentality, because whether you're dealing with fascism and Nazis on the right, or extreme communism on the left, I would argue that left-wing totalitarianism nowadays is much more of a threat, but that's my own personal view. But nevertheless, the important thing is that the salient features of both extreme totalitarian left and right is that are shared between the two. And I know a lot of political commentators and professors nowadays are ceasing to talk about the political spectrum in terms of a single continuum that moves from left-wing extremism all the way over to right-wing extremism. And now they tend to talk about something they call the horseshoe. So if you actually bend the horseshoe, the continuum around, you'll see that actually the totalitarianism on either end of the spectrum actually are in close proximity to one another. And there's a reason for that. Moreover, totalitarian regimes hate each other more than can possibly be articulated. They must necessarily try to dominate each other. It's not a historical accident that the Stalinist Russia, the Soviet Union, simply had to go to war with Adolf Hitler's Nazis. That was always going to happen. That was written in the stars. But my point here is that it's the totalitarianism and the ever-present threat of totalitarianism that I think the novel gets at, and gets at particularly well. And this was something that Orwell himself had a lot of experience with. I would argue that, well, there's a number of different other works here. You've mentioned Politics in the English Language. But let's talk a little bit about Orwell himself and how he came to have these views and how he garnered these insights on the totalitarian regime and its tendencies. I think I've said to you before that when it comes to the issues, political, cultural, social, literary, George Orwell and I would probably disagree on pretty well every single point out there. We're just going to disagree. That's how it works. On the other hand, I have actually a fair degree of admiration for the man himself. The man lived his life with a lot of integrity that compares particularly well to a lot of his contemporary writers who were around him. The man came from colonial backgrounds, from India. If you've read his short story, Shooting an Elephant,
yes.
He explores some of the interesting difficulties of being an authority figure in a colonized state. He himself came out of comparative obscurity, but like a number of other individuals we see at the beginning of the 20th century, he was particularly concerned about the plight of the impoverished and disenfranchised.
Mm.
And that's not uncommon. It was somewhat fashionable in its day. It's fashionable nowadays. But the difference with Orwell is that he actually did something about it. He wrote one of his first major works, largely written as more of a reporter than anything else, is Wigan Pier, which makes for a fascinating read. It explores the plight of coal miners in 1920s and 1930s England. And it paints a particularly bleak, stark, and striking portrait of what day-to-day life was like for, millions of men, quite frankly. And he lived down there and moved amongst them for a considerable period of time. This wasn't somebody who went into these bad social settings as a tourist. He lived amongst them and he lived as them. To get a better sense of this, he oftentimes lived homeless and vagrant. He would just tramp around Europe, quite frankly. And so, and if an editor or somebody wanted to get a hold of Orwell, this wasn't always easy to do because he had no fixed address sometimes. So the man knew about living at these bottom levels of human society because he lived and moved amongst them for long, long periods of time. He never did move to the big house on the hill or anything like that. He lived in a very humble dwelling for most of his life. Then at the end of his life, of course, he was living on an island. We can talk about that later. The man also played out those convictions in other ways. He was incensed, as many were, by the rise of fascism in nationalist Spain, and he enlisted in the International Brigade in 1936. So he put his money where his mouth was. He wasn't a posturer. And for his troubles, he got shot through the neck by a sniper. How he survived that, I really don't know, but he had an awful harrowing time of it. You can read about that in his short piece, Catalonia. And it was while he was wounded with this horrible wound in Spain that all of a sudden the Stalinist communists decided to purge themselves of every other form of communism in Spain. And he was hunted ferociously for an extended period of time. Probably would have ended with his execution had they caught him, as they dealt with all the other people. But he got to really see the horrors of what communism was in its real lived form. And these experiences, oftentimes very bitter experiences,
like
put him in a,
right?
Sorry, what was that?
Like Solzhenitsyn, same, yeah.
Yeah, so this is not somebody sitting back like you and I and analyzing a distant problem, a distant tendency, a distant regime, and how its machinery does its grim work. This is a man who's literally being hunted life or death by these very sorts of things in his own personal experience. So I've got a lot of respect for the guy, even if I disagree with him time and again.
That's really helpful. I think it's a helpful background to him. The only thing I would add to this is that he was in his background, although he had this background, as you say, as a minor Indian official, the son of a minor Indian official. So he was one of the sahibs, a minor ruler, as it were. He called them landless gentry, one of his famous phrases, gentry without really property or station per se, and not much by the way of income. But because of his brilliance, he ended up going to Eton. And while he was and Eton is the English public school where the royal family often historically went, and to this day many of the good and the great will go and send their children there. He studied there, and he studied there under Aldous Huxley. I thought that was an interesting part of his biography that should be mentioned, because both Huxley and Orwell are often mentioned for writing dystopian political novels. And so Brave New World, which we're not going to deal with on Paideia today, is I think a similar sort of novel in certain respects, and very different in others, because 1984 is a horror of a novel, and you cannot come away from it feeling good about it, whereas in Brave New World, it almost seems attractive. It almost sounds like this is a good way to go about things. They're both describing a totalitarian society. One is presenting it probably from the standpoint of the way it would be sold to people. We're going to give you as much sex and drugs and conditioning as you would ever want, and you will be as happy as can be. That's Huxley's. Whereas Orwell presents it in its brutality, and it really is brutal in that sense. And he bequeaths to us these terms, again, going back to this focus of language, that have not left the English language, like thought crime and doublespeak, the idea of news speak as well. All of these terms are being used in our current day, and before the program, you and I were both noting that whether you're on the left, so-called, or the right, so-called, both will accuse their opponents of being Orwellian. And so there's something that is fascinating about that. One, I think that both sides recognize the validity of Orwell's description of the human situation in the 20th century, and probably in the 21st, because it's very much used right now under the lockdown and COVID restrictions, and the restrictions of freedoms and the use of language and so forth. Both sides will use it. So they're describing something that I think does not appear before this period. So we've taken a broad historical view of literature going back from the ancient world to the present. Come the 20th century, there is something about the human situation that changes, and we need this sort of language. And what particularly changes is the view of human nature. In the ancient world, human nature was seen as a good thing, or it was what it was. It had virtues to be cultivated. It had weaknesses to be steeled against, but it was there, and the goods were personified in the form of gods often. The Christian view of humanity rather changed that. I think you can see that human nature is seen as good but fallen and corrupted by sin. Come this period, and it probably doesn't begin here, but it certainly by this point is now undeniable. Human nature is now nothing. It's something that can be constructed and disposed of and hollowed out, so that it is part of the technological society that other writers like Jacques Ellul will describe. It's become a thing to be commodified, to be disposed of as we will. And so terrific atrocities happen. And language, what we do with language, is one of the ways that men like Orwell describe that. And I think it's particularly appropriate that he does so. I think he's right on this front.
Yeah, one of the things that distresses me a fair bit is that for a long time, if it were properly taught in high schools, this novel, 1984, was in a position to alert a lot of young people about how language combines with totalitarian impulses to effect certain changes in what they think and who they are. I think nowadays it is becoming surpassingly rare that a teacher really does a good job of that, but it does still happen occasionally. But I also know that 1984, as a regularly read novel in high school, is also gradually being removed from the curriculum. And I find that distressing, because the very people who want it gone are doing many of the sorts of things that we actually encounter in the novel. Feels almost like there was an expose written of these individuals taking 1984 off the curriculum. So we have that. We also have, we got a number of tendencies also in here. We've spoken already a little bit about this, is the aggressive, systematic, tactical move away from individual value and identity. We have talked about that, but nowadays we live in an age which is really weaponizing that on a massive scale. It is moving through large institutions, I suspect, the media, popular culture, politics, the academy, whereby type identity is seen to be more morally and ethically virtuous than individual identity. And that's the grounding that you wanted. And of course, if you know your history, and if you've read your 1984, you'll know that this is a very common maneuver amongst totalitarian regimes. The Nazis did this, the Stalinists did this, the Khmer Rouge did this. The list is well nigh endless. Pick a totalitarian regime in the 20th century and they do this. Very
the North
famously,
Koreans do it, the Chinese do it.
Yes.
Any communist society does it.
Yes, and also those which have nationalistic totalitarian tendencies, like the Nazis, they do it as well. All of a sudden, you're a type, you're one of the Ubermensch and stuff like this. Very famously, Stalin's chief of secret police, Beria, told one of his junior policemen at a certain point when they were torturing and about to execute yet another victim, and the young policeman was coming apart under the stress of what he was doing to people. And Beria famously said to him, "You've got to stop thinking of him as an individual, and whether the individual committed an individual crime or anything like this. You need to think of him as a type. He's one of the proletariat, and the crime is being him. Now get to work." And I see this again here with things like critical race theory and stuff like this, and discussions around intersectionality and defining an individual's worth by which type group he or she fits into, whether it be by ethnicity, skin color, gender, what have you. This is all old stuff. If you've done enough reading, you'll recognize that this has happened pervasively historically. In the 20th century, you're right. The 20th century amps it up. But this is an old tendency, and this narrative always ends badly. And 1984 is an excellent novel to throw that into sharp relief, so you can actually see the dynamics in operation, how they work, and how they end up playing out.
Yeah, I actually read the novel 1984 in 1984. If you want to date me and see the vintage from which I came, that's when I read it, and I read it in the backdrop of the Cold War at that point, because that was still the age when the arms race was well and truly being ramped up by Reagan to the south, and at that point in the Soviet Union there was a similar arms race going on. Eventually that was ratcheted down under glasnost and perestroika with Gorbachev and so forth, but it was very much of a reality at that time. It was imaginable that this depicted a totalitarian society of the sort that existed behind the Iron Curtain. I think that's again, while it's accurate, it misses something of what Orwell is saying about how all societies are leaning into this direction, and you can see it even in our own society and its use of language. And that is one of the points I think we were going to want to talk about as well, is the way in which language, when it's used sloppily, invariably leads to atrocities. So that's a really interesting thing. But again, before we went on air, you and I mentioned the fact that the terrible atrocities that were committed in the Second World War were judged under tribunals that had not antedated that period. They came into existence right then. So the crimes against humanity with which the Nazis were charged did not exist before this period, because there was no legal body that would judge crimes of nations against other nations, but under a broader auspices, like, as I say, human rights and so forth. They didn't exist at that point. And the Hague and the international tribunals didn't exist. And this is the defense the Nazis gave of themselves, is what we did. We didn't do anything wrong. In our country, we did what was the legal thing to do. We did what was we were required to do. We had no choice in the matter. We had to obey a Hitler befehl. We had to. An order that came from the Führer had to be obeyed. That was the law of the land. So what are you charging us with here? We didn't. You're charging us with an international crime. Well, there is no such thing. So they said that you're making up. This is a court of the victors, and you're making up things. To some extent, they're correct. They're accurate. There was no such crime per se. So the use of the word crime here, that was created out of nothing. And the human rights that we have, regimes that we've pushed since the Second World War, are to some extent the product of the Second World War, to try and prevent the same atrocities from occurring. But we never got to the question, and I think this is really one of the big questions, is what is human nature? The question never really got answered. We didn't explore the grounds on which human beings were said to have rights. Because again, in China and in other regimes that are not of the Western vintage, they will just say, these are Western rights, these aren't human rights. You've made this up. These aren't human rights. This is what you say, but we dispute what you're saying is true. That's not our understanding of things. but we haven't grounded it in an anthropology. So there, we just say that human beings have rights. Well, what sort of being has rights?
And on
You
the
know,
basis of what? What is the
on the basis of
yardstick?
what? You've invented this out of nothing. Now, Christians in the time of the sort of Lewis, Tolkien, and Auden, and Eliot, the sorts of men that we've discussed recently, they will recognize the importance of this question, and it pushes them in the direction of the Christian faith to recognize the recognition that we need to have some sort of, to use the phrase, transcendental ground for establishing the validity of human nature, that an individual is something that is sacred, bears the imago Dei. They can't find that in the liberal tradition. They
No,
can't find, it's not there.
human nature in that tradition is very much a construct. And as a construct, according to the will of whoever is constructing it, either an individual or group, human nature is arbitrary. Just what constitutes it is arbitrary, which means that there's no given grounded noumenal reason for me respecting iterations on what constitutes human nature as a construct by these people. Which means that that judgments they're going to make, let's say a violation of human rights via human nature, is not necessarily something I'm going to respect for its own sake, because there's a degree of integrity in that iteration. Rather, it comes down to, and this is exactly what has happened in the postmodern period, it comes down to a discussion about, at the end of the day, about the illusions of justice and legitimacy obscuring the real dynamic, which is pure power, hegemonics, which decides what is right and what is wrong according to human nature.
Yeah, and this is for me, this is a really important point. This is one of the decisive factors. If you can point to reasons, and Christians will often say that it wasn't so much that they decided, but rather that they were compelled, they were drawn to follow God. God called them. They were brought into that relationship. But all the same, there are things that I can point to that were compelling to me about the Christian faith, and this was certainly one of them. And about the university, for that matter, I said to myself, the university is falling apart because it lacks this grounding for the humanities. I'm in the humanities disciplines, but where is the human nature that we are agreeing upon and defending here? When we're doing the humanities, what exactly are we looking into? What's the nature of the human?
Yes.
And I found in the academy that there not only is there no agreement on it, most of my fellow academics don't even think it's an important question, because they're in the business of constructing a human nature that's going to fit whatever views that they think are right. And so then we get into what you just said, the group identity type things, and then we get into what I would say is propaganda at that point. And Jacques Ellul is with me on that again, and so would George Orwell be, that we're getting into the realm of propaganda. What Orwell lacks, which I think some of the other writers don't, is that he doesn't have a transcendental ground. So he describes the problem, but he has nothing to solve the problem.
No, you get a sense of desperation from his later writings, where he has diagnosed and diagnosed and diagnosed the problem in ever greater and insightful detail. But what is to be done in the face of the disease? I don't think he has the framework to address that, to grapple with that. And the traditional response, of course, out of the tradition of the university, insofar as this was grounded in Christian theology and thinking and identity, was to point back and begin this apprehension of human nature from the perspective of a Christian, that is to say, a Christ-centered anthropology. And this, of course, brings us around to certain aspects from the Nicene councils and stuff like this about
Absolutely.
the figure of Christ being fully man and fully God in hypostatic union. They are simultaneously,
Yes.
the word and he who utters the word are simultaneous. And so there's a big, rich discussion philosophically waiting to happen there, which is very, very productive. But that discussion has long since been lost.
And it was the foundation of the university, which, remember, is a medieval institution. It's
Yes.
not that of the ancient world.
No.
So again, because as much as I said that the classical world had a robust understanding of human nature in the sense of virtues and could describe them and defend them, and iniquities to some degree, not that they would use that word, but weaknesses to be, they didn't have a sense of the integrity of human nature, or that a human being was in any sense valuable or important. Look at what the Greeks did to fellow Greeks. Look at what Achilles does to his opponents. He certainly shows no pity. Love is not important in the ancient world.
Not in that sense, not in the human
Not
sense. I'm thinking about the writings. I think I mentioned him before of, I think it's Cato the Elder, one of the
yes,
earliest pieces of Latin we have. And he's talking about um, a patrician's management sort of handbook of how you manage your estate and your farm and all the stuff that goes along with that. One of the things he mentioned, which I found very, very striking back in the day, was he talked about not getting sentimental about old slaves. If a slave of yours gets really old and is all of a sudden you're putting more resources and food and effort into maintaining the slave than he is actually turning out, that's a bad investment. Don't get sentimental about it, says Cato. Take him back to the dung heap, slice his throat, and go get yourself a new one that's going to actually produce. And I was struck by the sheer brute inhumanity.
there's yeah, it's like
Um,
slaughtering an animal. But at the same time, he would say treat your and Cicero as well would say treat your slaves well because they're valuable.
yeah,
If you
it's a
treat them well,
practical
they'll
choice.
perform better.
Yep, it's a practical choice. It's not, there's no intrinsic value to the person themselves. It's purely instrumental value again.
Yeah,
Let's talk a little bit about language here. I want to signal for our listeners the importance and also the usefulness of that little essay that you just mentioned here, Politics and the English Language. It
yeah,
is a short essay. It is a highly readable essay. It's not difficult to understand, but the potential benefit that the reader can get in terms of his or her engagement with language and politics, which, by the way, for Orwell are inextricably bound up together. You cannot talk about one without at least implying the other. This short little essay actually can give you a lot of really useful sort of handholds to grapple with what's happening with language and politics and culture and so on and so forth. So let's just talk a little bit about that essay, because many of its talking points are played out dramatically in 1984 in very, very striking ways. In fact, a lot of copies of 1984 literally have politics in the English language appended to the end to help you with your thinking about the concepts that are going on in there. So when Orwell wrote this essay, he wasn't doing anything particularly new. You should know that people have been lamenting the decay of language and, by way of extension, the decay of the English language since almost time immemorial. As long as there has been language, there has been some pedantic individual like you or I lamenting the decay of that language. That's all well and good. But Orwell did something unique in exploring the decay of the English language. While many people had been decrying and deploring the decay of the English language because it was giving us ever less efficient tools with which to communicate and operate as a society, Orwell took the radical turn to say that no, this is most fundamentally a moral and ethical problem. This is not a matter of efficiency. This is a matter of good and evil. And at that point, of course, everybody in the crowd sat up and started paying attention to what Orwell was saying. But he wanted to explore in its actual concrete details what exactly is going wrong with the English language when he was writing this essay. And he's got 4 points that he makes. And I'm just going to run over these very, very briefly here.
okay.
The first one are dead metaphors. And I would add to that worn out cliches and terminology of that sort. Orwell says we use these things because it saves people the effort of actually thinking critically about what they're trying to say. It arises oftentimes from laziness. And we find that a lot of people don't just use this in their writing and in their conversations, but they use it in their very thinking themselves. So this is happening in the brain. Remember, we said right at the beginning here of the 20th century that one of the big sort of battle cries of literary writers was make it new. And they were talking about language specifically and the use of dead metaphors and cliches and worn out language. And people just weren't thinking about what they were saying anymore, especially in literature, they lamented. So they wanted to remake the metaphors, the similes, the uses of figures of speech and stuff like that. They wanted to get rid of worn out, meaningless cliches and things of that nature so that we could actually think clearly and crisply and insightfully about the issues that were in front of us. But because laziness is another one of these standard pieces of the human condition, it's going to continuously threaten the language. And, you know, of course, I myself oftentimes have to be careful that I'm not actually doing that also, because I'll fall into it if I'm not on the alert here. He's also got another thing called false verbal limbs. These are vague phrases that take the place of precise verbs. I'm on my students all the time when it comes to their writing about doing this. I'll tell them, look, if you can use a more pointed, specific, precise, concrete word for what you want to talk about, always go for that option. Don't give me a vague umbrella term under which a whole bunch of subcategories can fit or say anything like that, because I'm going to have a hard time knowing what you're meaning. Where exactly are you going with this? You need to target your language at exactly what you mean to target with, like laser accuracy. It's what you want to be doing. And then it takes some time to actually exercise the student in doing that. T.S. Eliot even actually says this in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's so hard to say just what I mean. Yes, I know it is you, but don't talk around it. Hold yourself accountable for that kind of language and say exactly, not sort of, what you mean. And Orwell, of course, is very big on this point. Though you have to remember here, of course, sometimes that the person who's using these false verbal limbs sometimes is doing so not because he's lazy or not because he or she lacks the language skills, but sometimes they don't want to be easily pinned down. It's amongst politicians and lawyers and used car salesmen that you find this kind of language abuse all over the place. And it's there in those circles in high quantities for a very good reason. They've got something to hide. They want to talk around these issues. What else does he say here? Cliches allows you to spring to. Yes, he talks about active voice. Absolutely. That's one of his solutions to this. In case you're not familiar or you've forgotten what active voice is compared to passive voice. Active voice is where the subject of the sentence, that is to say, the person or thing doing the main verb, not what it's about, the thing doing the main verb is first, and then the predicate follows that thereafter. Passive voice goes the other way around. So I could say, Dr. Masson kicks the puppy. There we are. That's active phrasing. He doesn't kick the puppies. No puppies were harmed in the making of this analogy. On the other hand, if I flipped it around and say the puppy was kicked, now notice what happens. Dr. Masson is no longer easily held accountable for the kicking of puppies. I could stick his name in there, but it's optional. That's passive voice when I phrase it in that way. There are almost no circumstances when you should not be striving to use active voice. It forces you to be accountable for what you say and what you think. Anyway,
note that the passive voice, we have to use forms of to be to construct it so that it's static.
Yeah, not only
does a consequence.
Correct. So it opens itself to a far greater number of grammatical mistakes. That's one of the first things that comes out of it. And of course, if we don't know our grammar rules well, this is a prime venue in which to make mistakes in every direction. Second of all, it allows you to, like some of these other features here, it allows you to engage in a flight from accountability. Insincerity, said Orwell, is one of the absolute keys in the decay of the English language. If you find somebody who commits all these sort of language sins, you're probably oftentimes going to find somebody who is insincere, disingenuous, and is engaged in a flight from accountability. This is where it comes. This is where the moral tenor comes into the conversation. Now, if you get good at using these sorts of if you commonly make these mistakes on a regular basis and even use them deliberately as a strategy, what it allows you to do is to string together long streams of fashionable verbiage, which doesn't mean much of anything. Another tendency, jargon and specialized terminology. This is a very popular thing nowadays, especially you and I have experience with this in academia. Where they reinvent the language continuously and they just keep swapping out term after term after term. I have many students express dismay to me because there are there's half a dozen different legitimate terms for the persuasive essay. Why do we keep swapping out and inventing new terms for that? Well, it allows you to sound like you're a technical specialist in the area. You know the secret language, you know the jargon, and therefore you must be smarter than everybody who does not understand the jargon and the language. And so some people, as a compensatory measure, start using jargon in the most dizzying ways that are just about impossible to follow. And then overlaying that with cliches and worn out dead metaphors and stuff like this. False verbal limbs are all over the place as well. And the person can talk forever and say nothing and yet sound like they're making extremely fashionable intellectual noise as they do this here. And of course, Orwell calls this Duckspeak, and he's quite right to call it Duckspeak. It doesn't mean anything. It's like Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 wah. But it's fashionable noise. It's not actual speech anymore. It's fashionable noise. And I'm sure many of our readers have been in meetings where somebody doesn't have anything substantial to say, and yet that's precisely the person who just never shuts up. They just talk, and they use all these sorts of tendencies and stuff like this.
And the problem is that this decline is a self-perpetuating one, right?
Yes.
It's easier to think in poor English, and because we use poor English, then it's easier to think foolish thoughts, and that reinforces the use of poor English, and that just keeps it keeps declining. So I've noticed that administrators or government bureaucrats write in such appalling English that it's no longer grammatically correct even, and it makes no sense. It might make sense to the person using it, but I'm not even sure it makes sense to the person using the language anymore.
I have to admit, I have a bad tendency to admit to here. Every now and again, if I'm under a barrage of this kind of empty, dead, cliched, jargon-filled technical language, every now and again, I'm tempted, just for entertainment value, to stop the person mid-sentence and ask them to explain a certain point. And more times than not, the individual is unable to do so because he wasn't even aware of the ideas
what he
that
was saying. What did I say? Yeah.
And that's exactly what I hear. Over 50% of the time, that is exactly the phrase that comes back at me when I ask for clarification. I've got an example here that I spotted just the other day of what this stuff sounds like in real life. It is necessary, I'm quoting here, it is necessary to recalibrate traditional orientations regarding domestic realities so that in ecclesiastical praxis, they accord with current notional approaches encountered as they actually reify, end quote. That person, ladies and gentlemen, has not said anything. They've just made noise. But they sound very intelligent making the noise in a certain sense. And so it's formidable.
Yeah. So one of he offers certain solutions to this, but one of the things that he himself was taught, I found this interesting as well, is that the wife of the headmaster at St. Cyprian's before he went on to Eton, who taught him English, used to use the King James Bible and read the King James Bible to them and then offer a translation of it in some sort of modern English and note for the students how terribly the equivalents and the translations were compared to the original. And so Orwell himself, in the early on in the Politics in the English Language, cites Ecclesiastes 9:11, and then he translates it for it. But when he did that, I think he was doing much of what was given to him as an example. So for those of you who are interested in improving your English, go back and read something like the King James Bible. Find how powerful and evocative it is. So Ecclesiastes 9:11, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. And then he translates that, and what does he say? Objective consideration of contemporary phenomena compels the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. Now, this is effectively saying the same thing, but note the potency and the memorable expression of the former, and the latter, you're left wondering what exactly he said, and you have to think very, very hard to follow it, and it sounds impressive, the latter phrase as well. These were actually quite advanced vocabulary, I would say, and there's nothing grammatically incorrect about it, but it lacks any potency to it. The latter is full of cliches. It's instantly forgettable, whereas Ecclesiastes is a famous phrase, like many of the King James uses of language. So I encourage the readers, if they really want to remedy their own deficient use of language, which we all need to do, that they ought to do that.
Yeah, you make a good point. I should also note here that there are certain subspecies of Duckspeak that are germane to certain settings. So there's a subset of Duckspeak that fits in with the world of the governmental bureaucrat. There's a version of Duckspeak that fits into the academy. There's a version of Duckspeak which tends to speak from the pulpit. So there's all sorts of subspecies out there that come along with this. And also, I think, and again, this is just my opinion, Canada and many other Western nations have been putting more and more effort and money into infrastructure, which oftentimes is shorthand for making ever more Byzantine the bureaucracy that inhabits the land and governs the land, for that matter. And bureaucracy loves this kind of Duckspeak. They are addicted to Duckspeak. In fact, it's one of the ways you can spot a serial bureaucrat is that he or she will actually speak, like you were just giving us that example there.
I think that's relatively lucid compared to many of the things that I read. What I just read, the modern English equivalent, that was relatively lucid. Much of what bureaucrats write is impenetrable gibberish.
Yes, and the academics are at least as bad on this front. I remember when I began reading the French postmodernist existentialists, I thought for a while that I was a complete and absolute dunce. I had been relatively confident in my critical thinking skills up to that point, but then all of a sudden there I am trying to decipher a paragraph from Derrida, and it was proving absolutely, it was a leviathan of a task. And then eventually I decided I'm not going to try to interpret you, I'm going to try to translate you, which is a bit of a different thing. And when I began doing that and taking apart the concepts and reframing them and rephrasing them, I realized he's not saying anything. This is, or he's saying something completely contradictory. Or he's saying something that is patently and provably wrong. It's illogical. And then I realized that, wait a second, they're all speaking like this. And if we just interpret them, it's not because they were saying something difficult. There are philosophers who express very difficult ideas. If you read Sein und Zeit by Heidegger, it's a strain. You're gonna have to work hard, or Hegel on phenomenology, or something like that. This is difficult thinking, and language struggles to keep up. But then there's that other later species of philosopher who falls back on philosophical Duckspeak, and we end up in their world. So,
and it's interesting that the analytic philosophical tradition really takes off in this period, and I think for this reason, they're wanting to cut through the verbiage and use terms with precision. I applaud that, actually. I'm not in the analytic philosophical tradition, but I actually understand the desire for clear, concise, and accurate prose, and would add to it, we want also evocative and powerful in beautiful language, which is not their concern. It struck me while you were saying this about the moral tenor of the right use of language that Orwell recommends here. You can see something similar going on in other writers, although not talking about language per se, but they end up getting into that, like C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, where he talks about, again, when we give predications of values to things. So I will say that the waterfall, this is how it begins, is beautiful, and the objection is, no, it's sublime. And the teachers of the day are saying it's effectively just a subjective preference, and there's no difference really between beauty and sublimity anyway. And Lewis then gets into this whole issue of aesthetic judgments, and that what is at stake here is something genuinely real. Likewise of predications of goodness, same sort of thing. I think he would find in Orwell an ally on this front, even though they're not coming from the same camp. They recognize that without some sort of moral integrity, the language becomes a tool for the abuse of human beings.
Yes, I think all of that is true. I think both of them, well, actually, there's quite a number of figures in the 20th century who recognize this crisis in language. And I think it really comes down to, according to the way in which it's expressed by Orwell or Lewis in a very different sense, is that it's a flight from reality, it's a flight from truth. And by way of extension from that, coming from that, you have a flight from integrity, you have a flight from accountability, you have a flight from all these sorts of things, which are then they're essentially they're weaponized, they're loaded with potency because of there's been a fundamental break with truth and the truth of reality, extraneous to the human mind that perceives it in some phenomenological sense. I
And the
want to come
chief
back also.
reality is the reality of human nature and of divine nature, for
Yeah, I
that
mean,
matter. That reality, having broken from that, there's nothing to hold it down anymore.
no. So, this is, you and I would have to agree that a commitment to truth and a stand against deception and lying and the unreal in that sense, this is a moral field in which one operates. But that's, you and I can't assume that the individuals we speak with necessarily have the assumption that quote unquote lying is bad. If all reality is a construct, then there is no such thing as lying in the first place, and so you can't even begin to make a moral and ethical decisions about this kind of thing.
So let me give it an illustration. Let's say that, I mean, there are conspiracy theories about what's going on with COVID and lockdowns at the moment. Let's say that the intention of the vaccines was to kill people and not to help them, right? And the objection was that this couldn't possibly be the case because the vaccines don't do that, and so forth. Like, no, that's not the effect. But the real objection is that nobody would, who was in the position of the medical establishment, would possibly do something that was going to kill somebody in the name of helping them. They wouldn't possibly do that, and they couldn't possibly do that. And I would say, in response to that, why would they not do that? What view of human nature would restrain them from doing that exact thing? What would stop them from doing killing in the name of helping? And so, because this is what the Nazis did to other human beings. They regarded them as bags, sacks of meat, and they were things that could be disposed of. They dehumanized them. So what would restrain the medical profession from killing people in the name of
Another
helping them?
take on the
No, go ahead.
Another way in which this has commonly cropped up in the 20th century, another approach to the problem that you're talking about here. Of course, we have people who essentially are functionally amoral, and why wouldn't they do it if they can simply get away with it? If that is convenient and appealing to them, then they will do that, and that's of course what the Nazis did do.
Indeed.
But we also have another sort of wiggly tactic that's oftentimes used, where the individuals who are being harmed and or even killed are actually valued in some sense, but their value is lesser. And so we have all of a sudden we move into an idiom of lesser and greater human worth. And when, of course, this gets attached to type identity, this gets very, very chilling indeed. But the phrase that you hear again and again is that their sacrifice is ultimately for some kind of nebulous greater good. And that's very much an Orwellian point again. The greater good is always nebulous. They never say precisely what they mean by the greater good, because they can't. But as soon as you start hearing the language of sacrifice, particularly human sacrifice for overall greater good in some sort of utopian future, Orwell would tell you, and I agree with him, go to red, red, red alert.
Yeah.
So you heard this from the Stalinists, you heard this from the Khmer Rouge, you hear this from countless regimes. We have to make sacrifices.
Yes.
And particularly sacrifices based on human types rather than human individuals.
Very much so. Very, very good. And he, to use another novel of Orwell's, he describes that in Animal Farm, and the sort of polarization of groups that goes on there, and the sort of classification according to identity groups, as you've notified. I mean, and it often happens in the name of helping the defenseless, of the minorities. Right? And so the well-intentioned individuals that are trying to rectify the wrongs in the name of rights will oppress the ultimate minority, which is the individual. And they're willing to do that because they regard it as a greater good. You can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs.
Yep. And we should also mention here, I should mention before I forget, that oftentimes when these people are engaged in Duckspeak, it allows them to avoid accountability, particularly if they are a cultural or political figure. So they are deliberately vague. You and I can name probably half a dozen
almost anyone
politicians right now who never ever say anything measurable anytime they open their mouth. It's very, very common. But the danger, Orwell points out, is that That doesn't mean, just because they haven't said anything logical and concrete doesn't mean that they're not persuading. This is the sketchy bit. If they had said something clear and specific and concrete, people might have sat up and said, wait a second, that's heinous. No, we're not going ahead with that. We're not empowering you to do anything. In fact, you should be, locked up or something. But if you say things vaguely, but if you adopt the right spirit of discourse, you can convince by the spirit in which you speak rather than saying specific things in your speech. And you can watch Hitler do this again and again and again in his speeches. If you listen to what he's actually saying,
The subtext.
he's not saying much of anything.
No.
He's got popular sentiments. He's spouting them out. He's stringing them together in classic, in this case, Nazi Duckspeak. And the people are going wild. Well, why? The ideas aren't particularly engaging, but they're being expressed in a way that is powerful and fashionable, and and the spirit in which it's expressed catches the imagination of the adulatory audience, and they're carried away in a fervor by what is being said, when they themselves probably couldn't really clearly articulate what exactly they're all excited about right now.
Yeah.
And that's precisely the danger.
Yeah, and typical of demagogues that happens as well. But again, there's a difference between a demagogue and a totalitarian demagogue, because in a totalitarian demagogue, he has the entire state at his disposal, and that includes the use of the language and the use of means of communication. And again, going back to 1984, one of the really interesting things is their attempt to come up with newer and newer dictionaries which reduce the number of words that can even be used, and with it reduce the number of thoughts that can be had. So in a sense, it sounds a bit like what Orwell is proposing. We be concise in our use of language, but Orwell's not saying we get rid of words, but rather that we use the right words. Whereas in 1984, they are trying to get rid of words to reduce human sensibilities to those which the party approves of, and only those. So certain words are verboten. You must not use that word anymore. You used to use that word, but now you have to repudiate it, and then they rewrite history so that the word was never used, and you cannot find anybody who will tell you that that word was used. And if you find that person, we will make sure that they renounce that, and if they ever use it, then we'll have to re-educate them and send them to the Ministry of Love and take care of them.
That's right.
Right? And Winston Smith's problem is that he has enough historical awareness to know that things weren't always as they are, and what the party says is good is in fact a terrible thing, and they suffered a terrible defeat here. And I remember that very well, that what happened. Well, he has to get to the point where he no longer has any historical consciousness. He's been utterly hollowed out of all historical sense, so that the party is effectively God. And that we no longer hate Big Brother, we love Big Brother, even as he, like a boot stamping on our faces forever, destroys us. We love him in response. So it's an inversion of, I would say, Christianity and the ethos of love. It's the promotion of hate.
Yeah, I'd like to speak back to your point about vocabulary. We live in an age, this is not controversial. This is very, very, very well documented. We live in an age of radically crashing and burning vocabulary levels. We can prove that we are at less than a quarter of the vocabulary on average in North America that people had in 1948, year that Orwell wrote this novel.
Common people.
So there's many studies out there that track this. So people's ability, the vocabulary with which they speak, write, and above all, I would argue, think about both themselves and their identity and the world out there and their worldview, is breathtakingly crude. In only a few decades, it has become breathtakingly crude precisely because of this crashing and burning vocab levels. So I find that deeply, deeply disturbing.
So do I.
And moreover, what vocabulary is left to these poor individuals is ever increasingly crudely defined. Many of these words don't mean precisely what they used to mean back in the day. Now they mean something broad and vague and untrackable, and the person using them themselves don't really know what they mean by using that term or that phrase.
And if you ask them to define it, they'll be angry.
Yes, they get defensive very, very quickly. You bring up another point here that I find fascinating, is that we live in an age where single individuals oftentimes hold a great web or network of mutually contradictory ideas in their head simultaneously, veering both sides of those contradictory points to be simultaneously true. And I hear this all the time. And when I pointed out, speaking of outrage, that's, if you want to see somebody get genuinely angry, that's one of the ways to make them genuinely angry. Point out the fact that they aggressively hold two mutually exclusive ideas simultaneously, and that they're even promoting them out there in the world.
So this is
This
why
is classic doublethink.
contemporary lit theory is at war with the words, and they're at war with the law of non-contradiction. Words can mean, as you said, two contradictory things can be held at the exact same time in the exact same way, and they will not blink an eye at doing so. This is a war on language and a war on ideas and a war on ultimately a war with God. But since we cannot get at God, we will be at war with the human beings that bear his image. That's what's going on here.
Yes, it's war on the truth again. It's war on reality. It's war on meaning. It's war on all these things that traditionally we have thought to be good things to be cultivated in our fellow man and in ourselves. The last thing I want to talk about, and you just spoke about this glancingly here, is the sudden fluidity and flexibility of history. We talked about this a little bit already with T.S. Eliot, who recognized that we're moving into crisis on these fronts here. And T.S. Eliot quite succinctly points out, elegantly points out, I would argue, that cultural fertility depends upon the mixing of memory and desire. Your memory of the past shapes and frames and informs your desires for the future. Now, if somebody can take control of that memory, like the state, then all of a sudden they can control your desires for the future. Here we find in 1984 that Winston has to treat history as endlessly, infinitely, and impossibly flexible. That which was true yesterday of the past now is the opposite. And it's Winston's job to facilitate that, to make that happen. And we see a lot of rewriting of history right now. We live in an age in 2021 when we are obsessed in some senses with history, but it's the rewriting of history and the dynamics that inform the rewriting of history that I think require incredibly close, careful attention at this point in history. But in the 20th century, we've gone further than that in many venues, and I'm mentioning here particularly in universities and high schools here, whereas there is no real historical knowledge of any kind whatsoever at all. Anytime that historical knowledge is promulgated to the student, it is oftentimes with a view to causing that student to hate the history, and therefore this will energize that student's sympathy for wherever the teacher, the historian, wants him or her to take their desires for the future. If you can make people hate their history, you can do a lot with their desires. And this is something that Orwell, I think, quite usefully explores in 1984. It is everywhere.
Yeah, it's also alarming, since you're talking about contemporary applications of this, the decline in the interest in history, in the study of history. You can see this in universities. Some evangelical colleges have got rid of history, the study of history altogether. This is not only an alarming tendency, it is a crisis situation. As you say, if you can't, everyone who has a history is somebody who is has an identity that you can reckon with. A person without a memory of himself, without a history, is an amnesiac. An amnesiac has all sorts of problems. One of them is that that person who suffers from amnesia doesn't know what who people are. Like, it's a world of strangers around him, right? So they have no idea. That's the problem for that person. So it's a horrifying scenario for the amnesiac. It's also a horrifying scenario for everyone else around that person, because that person who you once knew and had this, blow to the head, no longer will act in accordance with the relationships that have been built up between you. So you literally cannot trust that person to do what you once would have trusted that person to do, because he no longer has that moral repository of relationships and memories that have informed that person to be the person that he is. The eradication of history is making us into an amnesiac society.
I agree.
And what that does is orient us towards a future, as you say, which looks to us, or I'll say on my behalf, looks to me like it's an impoverished intellectual atmosphere, and we're being conditioned towards a dehumanized future. That's what I see is happening all around us. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do Paideia Today. I thought it was a good exercise in the great works of humanity, and it humanized our listeners by reading these books along with us, and to some degree allowing us to be guides for them to uh, make up for those deficits, which the education system was no longer doing. I was told, I don't know if this is true, that the Toronto libraries were chucking out old books, or maybe it was the Toronto school boards, that they were purging their bookshelves of books that were older than 7 years or something and replacing them with new books.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had to make room on the shelves. Well, that in its, I mean, I can understand the practical dimensions of needing more space for books, but eradicating old books and replacing them with new ones is not a neutral activity or just a matter of pragmatics. This is a cultural vandalism that's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally in the Communist Manifesto that one of your first moves as you try to set up a totalitarian regime is that you wipe out history and then rewrite it if you want to rewrite it at all. But yeah, you can probably do a lot of good, you can probably do a lot of very effective things if then you rewrite history for the students. But it's one of your first moves. We've got the old Shakespearean line, first thing we do, kill all the lawyers. Well, with totalitarians, first thing you do is kill all the historians and get rid of their books as well while you're at it.
Yeah.
And it's not an uncommon, it's a very disturbing but common tendency that I'm encountering nowadays, where I'll run into students who say certain things about history, political history, cultural history, military history, stuff like this, which is just dead bang wrong. And they believe ardently
There's no evidence for it whatsoever. Sometimes it's flatly mendacious.
I had a young woman say to me the other day, well, you know, in the 1950s, husbands were wildly abusive and they beat their wives and they didn't. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You can like find lots of contemporary sources where they're actually vilifying those people. That clearly is something that would have been considered heinous back in the 1950s. So why do you think that that was everybody's lived reality in the 1950s in terms of domestic history? That's just not the case, but they have been educated in those directions and they're very angry at this new understanding of the past, which is the only understanding of the past that they have.
Yeah. And they're going to rectify those wrongs, or the so-called wrongs. And again, so then it becomes very much like Orwell's novels, where they're going to have their 2 minutes of hate, and they're going to vent their spleen against some figure that they see on the screen, and they're going to be motivated by that, and they have a purpose and meaning in life. Of course, it's that the party has given them. But other than that, there is nothing there, and it is just based on hate.
And when individuals in modern society don't have a clear basis for their own value as individuals, then feeling good or bad about yourself becomes extremely difficult, and I would argue even a very intimidating sort of a process. And I think that this is part of what fuels what I would describe as the rise of outrage culture, where a large slice of the demographic is deeply addicted to outrage because this underscores your moral superiority to the criminals, however defined. And the more aggressively and strenuously you are outraged at the criminals, the largely invented criminals oftentimes, the more it underscores your value as a moral and ethical being who can't find any other basis for moral and ethical value from any other sort of source because they're not grounded anymore. So this is a very addicting sort of an undertaking. And I see it everywhere. If you watch the riots,
what anthropologists call scapegoating takes place then, right?
Yeah, I think this explains a lot of the viciousness we see in what should be civil, political, and cultural and philosophical debate on the internet. Happens all the time, along with the fact that you're not accountable face to face to it for a lot of the things you say. But I also think it informs a lot of the sheer hatred, there's no other word for it, that you see expressed in these giant riots that are happening largely south of the border, whether it's under BLM or Antifa in Portland and Seattle and stuff like this. These people are insanely violently angry, and they come out every single night and indulge for another sort of fix of these sorts of things. And it's, you have to ask yourself, what explains this? What informs this kind of behavior? By the way, I found a piece of jargon which has been invented to define the production of jargon. It's re-lexicalization.
Nice.
Re-lexicalization.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm going to use that one today in conversation somewhere.
But the effect of this fog, this newspeak, the growing obscurity of the English language is not a neutral thing. It is an insidious thing, and I'm not sure where else we can go with this. We could talk about identity politics and apply it and talk about that sort of thing. I think we move a bit away, and we've already done that to some extent, but we move a bit away from Orwell here.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, we enter and get closer to the contemporary in these episodes of Paideia Today. I find that it's harder to find myself distanced from the issues that the writers are talking about, and to some extent to be objective and fair-minded about some of the things. Sometimes because I don't like the authors, but often because what the writers are describing is the very climate in which I'm living, and they are giving me language with which to see these things, but I can't get any distance to see where it's all going, other than in the case of 1984 and politics of and the English language, to recognize that what he's saying is so important that it must be rectified in some way. And so for me, pulling back as a Christian academic, I say, well, what is the solution to this problem that Orwell has identified? And as an English teacher, it is in encouraging my students to use good English, to use proper English, speak properly, write clearly, concisely, avoid verbiage, use not cliches and worn out. If you listen to sports radio or any entertainment or even the political discourse, it's so corrosive that because you repeat the same vain phrases over and over, and you find that some people use nothing but these cliches in their language. So what do you do? Well, I think reading great books, and again, the sort of language that we find in scripture is not only basing on good words, but on a transcendental reality, God's revealed truth, that I think is wholly a helpful thing. And it wasn't that long ago that students, even in the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, students were encouraged to read their Bibles. If they wanted to study literature, you have to know your Bible. I would encourage all of our listeners to do exactly that. I thought it was good advice back then. At first, I wouldn't say I bridled at it, but I thought, that's a strange, I didn't expect you to say that. But the more I studied, the more I realized that it wasn't only sound advice, it was absolutely essential advice. And that was part of the, and then so there's a personal reformation that's going on there. And with that, then you can go out and see the problems in others and move other people in the same direction.
Yeah, I remember I got a piece of striking advice from a certain creative writing professor back in the day. I think probably the only really useful piece of advice I got from that individual, who said that if you want, the number one thing you can do to write well creatively is to just read a lot. And initially I thought it was a rather trite thing to say. But the more I grew in my experience of literature, the more I realized that she actually had quite a valid point there. There is something about well-used language which seeps into the mind and becomes subconscious language usage on your own behalf. You just find yourself almost not against your will, but without you necessarily calling on the ability explicitly, you find yourself increasing in precision and eloquence and all these sorts of things. Reading scripture there's a reason why we talk about the language usage in the Bible as being one of these shining exemplars of the good use of English language. It is. That, along with Shakespeare, are the two biggest influences on modern English, and for good reason, positive reasons. There was another thing I wanted to say there. It's gone out of, oh yeah, you mentioned how you and I are increasingly, as we move up historically through these texts, you and I are put under ever greater duress to not get personal, because a lot of this stuff is lived experience for you and I. But I think it's important that we strive to do so, admitting our failings where we do, because I do fail. But one of the things that's being pushed very aggressively in the academy and in popular culture, more broadly speaking today, is that everything, including reading practices and domestic life and everything, is political / personal,
Yeah.
which seems like a strange collocation of personal and political. I thought the political was public and your personal life was whatever it was. No, they're one and the same thing now. And if you actually accept that demand, that imperative, that everything is political and personal, then all of a sudden you find yourself in a very ugly place and dangerous place indeed. And I think that's something that needs to be resisted. For my part, as a professional, I'm going to continue to try to be as objective as I can, knowing that that task gets harder and harder as we move up here towards 2021.
More than objective, charitable.
Yes, charitable, open-minded, but not being a doormat to other people's ideas, staying critical at the same time, admitting when all of a sudden I'm wrong, locating my own contradictions of thought and speech. All of this is part of, ultimately it feeds into self-respect at the end of the day, but it's not easy. You were mentioning a few rules about writing here, and I thought maybe Orwell's 6 rules from
Okay.
politics in the English language would be
Let's
briefly
conclude with
useful.
that. Yeah, do that.
Yeah. So number 1, never use figures of speech, slang, or jargon, which is common. Okay, you want to avoid that. If you catch yourself doing that, stop yourself, try to find new ways of phrasing it that aren't worn out and jargony. Second, never use long words when a short one will do. And I would say, by way of extension, never use a long phrase when a short phrase will do. Third, if possible, always cut words out. This is something that some people don't understand about the English language. The shorter version is always the best version, as long as it captures the idea accurately. And the man or the woman who can express their idea precisely in a few perfectly chosen words will be admired for that skill. That's a golden skill. That's a wonderful skill to have, but it doesn't show up overnight. You have to work for months and years at that skill. It's like a muscle that you build up in a gym. Fourth, use active voice wherever possible. You've already spoken about that. Fifth, never use technical, intellectual, or foreign words when a normal English equivalent is available. Also a good idea. A lot of people, when they're trying to dress up their language, they start drawing on foreign vocabulary and stuff like this. It's not the author's body of work, it's his oeuvre, and it's not his greatest work ever, it's his magnum opus. And okay, I get the point. Sixth, break any of these rules if they force you to speak barbarously. So I thought, well, that's not bad by way of 6 rules. I would have added stuff myself, but of course you and I are both language geeks, and so we can't help but tinker with this stuff.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of cliches and cliched language, our next author we're looking at here is Flannery O'Connor, and we're going to look specifically at her short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, wherein we find the main character, the protagonist, actually lives her life by moral and ethical cliches. So in some senses, it's an extension of our conversation today that we're going to be moving into there. But now we're going to be moving out of the realm of mere language and into full-on into moral and ethical ramifications and how to live the authentic life and stuff like that. Dr. Masson, did you have anything you wanted to say specifically about next week's reading?
Not really touched on it. It's interesting that what the issue is effectively hypocrisy.
Yes.
And when we think of hypocrisy, we think of that, how the phrase was first used, at least in common understanding, that of Jesus accusing the Pharisees of being hypocrites. Actors. That is really what we're talking about here. Underlying this whole discussion really is, well, what does it mean to be authentic then? And what does it mean to do truly and not falsely, not to act, but act as in to pretend, but to be genuinely human in our actions and our interactions with others. So I'd like to add that at the conclusion, and once again draw your attention to our new website, PaideiaToday.com. There will be more information coming up there over the next few months. We're trying to get some masterclasses up and going, but we'll have all of the episodes that we've produced there available, and hopefully we'll have other goodies, as I say, in the months ahead. But that's it for me today. How about you, Bill? That's it?
That will conclude nicely, folks.
Okay,
Take
well,
care,
then that's
and
us
thanks
for
for joining
Paideia
us.
Today. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Take care, everyone.